So I found some audiobook recordings of Love in the Time of Cholera, but it stopped in the middle of chapter 2. And to help me get through it, and maybe someone else, I'm just gonna finish chapter 2 here. I'm gonna start in the middle of page 82 and just go to the end of chapter 2. It's about 20 pages. So middle of page 82, we're gonna start with then Lorenzo Daza. It's about a third of the way down. Then Lorenzo Daza leaned back in his chair. His eyelids reddened and damp, and his left eye spun in its orbit and stayed twisted towards the outside. He too lowered his voice. "Don't force me to shoot you," he said. Florentino Ariza felt his intestines filling with cold froth, but his voice did not tremble because he felt himself illuminated by the Holy Spirit. "Shoot me," he said, with his hand on his chest. "There is no greater glory than to die for love." Lorenzo Daza had to look at him sideways like a parrot to see him with his twisted eye. He did not pronounce the 4 words so much as spit them out, one by one. Son of a bitch. That same week, he took his daughter away on the journey that would make her forget. He gave her no explanation at all, but burst into her bedroom, his mustache stained with fury and his chewed cigar, and ordered her to pack. She asked him where they were going, and he answered, "To our death." Frightened by a response that seemed too close to the truth, she tried to face him with the courage of a few days before, but he took off his belt, and with its hammered copper belt, twisted it around his fist, and hit the table with a blow that resounded through the house like a rifle shot. Fermina Daza knew very well the extent and occasion of her own strength, and so she packed a bedroll with 2 straw mats and a hammock, and 2 large trunks with all her clothes, certain that this was a trip from which she would never return. Before she dressed, she locked herself in the bathroom and wrote a brief farewell to Florentino Ariza on a sheet torn from the back of toilet paper. Then she cut off her entire braid at the nape of her neck with cuticle scissors, rolled it inside a velvet box embroidered with gold thread, and set it along with the letter. It was a demented trip. The first stage along the ridges of the Sierra Nevada, riding muleback in a caravan of Andean mule drivers, lasted 11 days, during which time they were stupefied by the naked sun or drenched by the horizontal October rains, and almost always petrified by the numbing vapors rising from the precipices. On the 3rd day, a mule maddened by gadflies fell into a ravine with its rider, dragging along the entire line, and the screams of the man and his pack of 7 animals tied to another continued to rebound along the cliffs and gullies for several hours after the disaster, and continued to resound for years and years in the memory of Fermina Daza. All her baggage plunged over the side with the mules, but in the centuries-long instant of the fall, until the scream of terror was extinguished at the bottom, she did not think of the poor dead mule driver or his mangled pack, but of how unfortunate it was that the mule she was riding had not been tied to the others as well. It was the first time she had ever ridden, but the terror and unspeakable privations of the trip would have not seemed so bitter to her if it had not been for the certainty that she would never see Florentino Ariza again, or have the consolation of his letters. She had not said a word to her father since the beginning of the trip, and he was so confounded that he hardly spoke to her even when it was an absolute necessity to do so, or he sent the mule drivers with her to her with messages. When their luck was good, they found some roadside inn that served rustic food, which she refused to eat, and rented them canvas cots stained with rancid perspiration and urine. But more often they spent the night in Indian settlements in open-air public dormitories built at the side of the road, with their rows of wooden poles and roofs of bitter palm, where every passerby had the right to stay until dawn. Fermina Daza could not sleep through a single night as she sweated in fear and listened in the cold darkness to the coming and going of silent travelers who tied their animals to the poles and hung their hammocks where they could. At nightfall, when the first travelers would arrive, the place was uncrowded and peaceful, but by dawn it has transformed into a fairground, with a mass of hammocks hanging at different levels, and Aruic Indians from the mountains sleeping on their haunches with the raging of the tethered goats and the uproar of the fighting cocks in their pharaonic crates, in the panting silence of the mountain dogs, who had been taught not to bark because of the dangers of war. Those privations were familiar to Lorenzo Daza, who had trafficked through the region for half his life and almost always met up with old friends at dawn, for his daughter was a perpetual agony. The stench of the loads of salted catfish added to the loss of appetite caused by her grief and eventually destroyed her habit of eating, and if she did not go mad with despair, it was because she always found relief in the memory of Florentino Ariza. She did not doubt that this was the land of forgetting. Another constant terror was the war. Since the start of the journey, there had been talk of the danger of running into scattered patrols, and the mule drivers had instructed them in the various ways of recognizing the two sides, so that they could act accordingly. They often encountered squads of mounted soldiers among the command of an officer who rounded up new recruits by roping them as if they were cattle on the hoof. Overwhelmed by so many horrors, Fermina Daza had forgotten about the one who seemed more legendary than imminent, until one night when a patrol of unknown affiliation captured two travelers from the caravan and hanged them from the campano tree half a league from the settlement. Lorenzo Daza did not even know them, but he had them taken down and gave them a Christian burial in thanksgiving for not having met a similar fate. And he had reasons. The assailants had wakened him with a rifle in his stomach and a commander in rags, his face smeared with charcoal, and shone a light on him, and asked him if he was liberal or conservative. Neither one or the other, said Lorenzo Daza. I am a Spanish subject. What luck, said the commander, and he left with his palm raised in salute. Long live the king. 2 days later, they descended to the luminous plain where the joyful town of Valledupar was located. There were cockfights in the patios, accordion music on the street corners, riders on thoroughbred horses, rockets, and bells. A pyrotechnical castle was being assembled. Fermina Daza did not even notice the festivities. They stayed in the home of Uncle Lysimaco Sanchez, her mother's brother, who had come out to receive them on the King's Highway at the head of a noisy troop of young relatives, riding the best bred horses in the entire province, and they were led through the streets of the town to the accompaniment of exploding fireworks. The house was on the Grand Plaza, next to the colonial church that had been repaired several times, and it seemed more like the main house on a hacienda because of its large somber rooms and its gallery that faced an orchard of fruit trees and smelled of hot sugarcane juice. Top of page 85. No sooner had they dismounted in the stables than the reception rooms were overflowing with numerous unknown relatives, whose unbearable effusiveness was a scourge to Fermina Daza, for she was incapable of ever loving anyone else in this world. She suffered from saddle burn, and she was dying of fatigue and loose bowels, and all she longed for was a solitary and quiet place to cry. Her cousin Hildebranda Sanchez, 2 years older than she, and with the same imperial haughtiness, was the only one who understood her condition as soon as she saw her, because she too was being consumed in the fiery coals of reckless love. When it grew dark, she took her to the bedroom that she had prepared to share with her, and seeing the burning ulcers on her buttocks, she could not believe that she still lived. With the help of her mother, a very sweet woman who looked as much like her husband as if they were twins, she prepared a bath for her and cooled the burning with arnica compresses, while the thunder of the gunpowder castle shook the foundations of the house. At midnight, the visitors left, the public fiesta scattered into the smoldering embers, and cousin Hildebranda left Fermina Daza a mandopolem nightgown, and helped her to lie down in a bed with smooth sheets and feather pillows. Without warning, she was filled with this instantaneous panic of happiness. When at last they were alone in the bedroom, cousin Hildebranda bolted the door with a crossbar, and from under the straw matting of her bed took out a manila envelope sealed in wax with the emblem of the National Telegraph. It was enough for Fermina Daza to see her cousin's expression of radiant malice for the pensive scent of white gardenias to grow again in her heart's memory, and then she tore the red sealing wax with her teeth and drenched the 11 forbidden telegrams in a shower of tears until dawn. Then he knew. Before starting out on the journey, Lorenzo Daza had made the mistake of telegraphing the news to his brother-in-law, Lysimaco Sanchez, and he in turn had sent the news to his vast and intricate network of kinfolk in numerous towns and villages throughout the province, so that Florentino Ariza not only learned the complete itinerary, but also established an extensive brotherhood of telegraph operators who would follow the trail of Fermina Daza to the last settlement in Cabo de la Vela. This allowed him to maintain intensive communications with her from the time of her arrival in Valledupar, where she stayed 3 months until the end of her journey, and Riohacha, a year and a half later, When Lorenzo Dasa took it for granted that his daughter had at last forgotten that he decided to return home. Perhaps he was not even aware of how much he had relaxed his vigilance, distracted as he was by the flattering words of the in-laws who, after so many years, had put aside their tribal prejudices and welcomed him with open arms as one of their own. The visit was a belated reconciliation, although that had not been its purpose. As a matter of fact, the family of Romina Sanchez had been opposed in every way to her marrying an immigrant with no background who was a braggart and a bore and who always was traveling, trading his unbroken mules in a business that seemed too simple to be honest. Lorenzo Dasa played for high stakes because his sweetheart was the darling of a typical family of the region, an intricate tribe of wild women and soft-hearted men who were obsessed to the point of dementia with their sense of honor. Romina Sanchez, however, settled on her desire with the blind determination of love when it is opposed, and she married him despite her family with so much speed and so much secrecy that it seemed as if she had done so not for love, but to cover over with a sacramental cloak some premature mistake. 25 years later, Lorenzo Dasa did not realize his intransigence in his daughter's love affair was a vicious repetition of his own past, and he complained of his misfortune to the same in-laws who had opposed him, and they complained in their day to their own kin. Still, the time he spent in lamentation was time his daughter gained for her love affair. So that while he went about castrating calves and taming mules on the prosperous lands of his in-laws, she was free to spend time with a troop of female cousins under the command of Hildebrand Sanchez, the most beautiful and obliging of them all, whose hopeless passion for a married man and father who was 20 years older than she had to be satisfied with furtive glances. Top of 87. After their prolonged stay in Valle Tupar, they continued their journey through the foothills of the mountains, crossing flowering meadows and dreamlike mesas, and in all the villages they were received as they had been in the first, with music and fireworks and new conspiratorial cousins and punctual messages in the telegraph offices. Romina Dasa soon realized that the afternoon of their arrival in Valle Tupar had not been unusual, but rather that in this fertile province every day of the week was lived as if it were a holiday. The visitors slept wherever they happened to be at nightfall, and they ate wherever they happened to be hungry, for these were houses with open doors, where there was always a hammock hanging and 3 meat stews simmering on the stove, in case guests arrived before the telegram announced their arrival, and was almost always the case. Hildebrand Sanchez accompanied her cousin for the remainder of the trip, guiding her with joyful spirit through the tangled complexities of her blood to the very source of her origins. Romina Dasa learned about herself. She felt free for the first time. She felt herself befriended and protected, her lungs full of the air of liberty, which restored her tranquility and her will to live. In her final years, she would still recall that trip, that, with the perverse lucidity of nostalgia, became more and more recent in her memory. One night, she came back from her daily walk, stunned by the revelation that one could be happy not only without love, but despite it. The revelation alarmed her because one of her cousins had surprised her parents in conversation with Lorenzo Dasa, who had suggested the idea of arranging the marriage of his daughter to the only heir to the fabulous fortune of Cleofas Moscote. Romina Dasa knew who he was. She had seen him in the plazas, pirouetting his perfect horses with trappings so rich they seemed ornaments used for the mass, and he was elegant and clever, and had dreamer's eyelashes that could make the stones sigh, but she compared him to her memory of poor emaciated Florentino Ariza sitting under the almond trees in the little park with the books of verses on his lap, and she did not find even the shadow of a doubt in her heart. In those days, Hildebrand de Sanchez was delirious with hope after visiting a fortune-teller whose clairvoyance had astonished her. Dismayed by her father's intentions, Romina Dasa also went to consult with her. The card said there was no obstacle in her future to a long and happy marriage, and that prediction gave her back her courage, because she could not conceive of such a fortunate destiny with any man other than the one she loved. Exalted by that certainty, she assumed command of her fate. That was how the telegraphic correspondence with Florentino Ariza stopped being a concerto of intentions and illusory promises and became methodical and practical and more intense than ever. They set dates, established means, pledged their lives to the mutual determination to marry without consulting anyone wherever and however they could, as soon as they were together again. Fermina Daza considered this commitment so binding that the night her father gave her permission to attend her first adult dance in the town of Fonseca, she did not think it was decent to accept without the consent of her fiancé. Florentino Ariza was in the transient hotel that night, playing cards with Lotaria Tugat, when he was told he had an urgent telegram on the line. It was the telegraph operator from Fonseca who had keyed in through 7 intermediate stations so that Fermina Daza could ask permission to attend the dance. When she obtained it, however, she was not satisfied with the simple affirmative answer, but asked for proof that it was in fact Florentino Ariza operating the telegraph key at the other end of the line. More astonished than flattered, he composed an identifying phrase, "Tell her that I swear by the crowned goddess." Fermina Daza recognized the password and stayed at her first adult dance until 7 in the morning, when she had to change in a rush in order not to be late for mass. But then she had more letters and telegrams in the bottom of her trunk than her father had taken away from her, and she had learned to behave with the air of a married woman. Lorenza Daza interpreted these changes in her manner as proof that distance and time had cured her of her juvenile fantasies, but he never spoke to her about his plans for the arranged marriage. Their relations had become fluid within the formal reserve that she had imposed since the expulsion of Aunt Scholastica, and this allowed them such a comfortable modus vivendi that no one would have doubted that it was based on affection. It was at this time that Florentino Ariza decided to tell her in the letters of his determination to salvage the treasure of the sunken galleon for her. It was true, and it had come to him in a flash of inspiration one summer afternoon when the sea seemed paved with aluminum because the numbers of fish brought to the surface by Mullein. All the birds of the air were in an uproar because of the kill, and the fishermen had to drive them away with their oars so they would not have to fight with them for the fruits of that prohibited miracle. The use of the mullein plant to put the fish to sleep had been prohibited by law since colonial times, but it continued to be a common practice among the fishermen of the Caribbean until it was replaced by dynamite. One of Florentino Ariza's pastimes during Fermina Daza's journey was to watch from the jetties as fishermen loaded their canoes with enormous nets filled with sleeping fish. At the same time, a gang of boys who swam like sharks asked curious bystanders to toss coins in the water so they could dive to the bottom for them. They were the same boys who swam out to meet the ocean liners for that purpose, and whose skill in the art of diving had been subject of so many tourist accounts written in the United States and Europe. Florentino Ariza had always known about them, even before he knew about love. But it had never occurred to him that perhaps they might be able to bring up the fortune from the galleon. It occurred to him that afternoon, and from the following Sunday until Fermina Daza's return, almost a year later, he had an additional motive for delirium. Middle of page 89. After talking to him for only 10 minutes, Euclides, one of the boisometers, came as excited as he was at the idea of underwater exploration. Florentino Ariza did not reveal the whole truth of the enterprise, but he informed himself thoroughly regarding his abilities as a diver and navigator. He asked him if he could descend without air to a depth of 20 meters, and Euclides told him yes. He asked him if he was prepared to sail a fisherman's canoe by himself in the open sea in the middle of a storm with no instruments other than his instinct, and Euclides told him yes. He asked him if he could find a specific spot 16 nautical miles to the northwest of the largest island in the Sotavento archipelago, and Euclides told him yes. He asked him if he was capable of navigating by the stars at night, and Euclides told him yes. He asked him if he was prepared to do so for the same wages the fishermen paid him for helping to fish, and Euclides told him yes, but with an additional 5 reals on Sundays. He asked him if he knew how to defend himself against sharks, and Euclides told him yes, for he had magic tricks to frighten them away. He asked him if he was able to keep a secret, even if they put him in the torture chambers of the Inquisition, and Euclides told him yes. In fact, he did not say no to anything, and he knew how to say yes with so much conviction that there was no way to doubt him. Then the boy reckoned expenses. Renting the canoe paddle, renting fishing equipment so that no one would suspect the truth behind their incursions, It was also necessary to take along food, a demijohn of fresh water, an oil lamp, a pack of tallow candles, and a hunter's horn to call for help in case of emergency. Euclides was about 12 years old, and he was fast and clever and an incessant talker with an eel's body that could slither through a bullseye. The weather had tanned his skin to such a degree that it was impossible to imagine its original color, and this made his big yellow eyes seem more radiant. Florentino Ariza decided on the spot that he was the perfect companion for an adventure of such magnitude, and they embarked without further delay the following Sunday. They sailed out of the fisherman's port at dawn, well provisioned and better disposed. Euclides, almost naked, with only the loincloth that he always wore, and Florentino Ariza, with his frock coat, his tenebrous hat, and his patent leather shoes, the poet's bow at his neck, and a book to pass the time during the crossing to the islands. From the very first Sunday, he realized that Euclides was as good a navigator as he was a diver, and that he had astonishing knowledge of the character of the sea and the debris in the bay. He could recount in the most unexpected detail the history of each rusting hulk of a boat. He knew the age of each buoy, the origin of each piece of rubbish, the number of links in the chain with which the Spaniards closed off the entrance of the bay. Fearing that he might also know the real purpose of his expedition, Florentino Ariza asked him sly questions, and in this way realized that Euclides did not have the slightest suspicion of the sunken galleon. Ever since he had first heard the story of the treasure in the transient hotel, Florentino Ariza had learned all he could about the habits of galleons. He learned about the San Jose was not the only ship in the coral depths. It was, in fact, the flagship of the terra firma fleet, and had arrived here after May 1708, having sailed from the legendary fair of Portobello in Panama, where it had taken on part of its fortune, 300 trunks of silver from Peru to Veracruz, and 110 trunks of pearls gathered and counted on the island of Contadora. During the long month it had remained here, the days and nights had been devoted to popular fiestas, and the rest of the treasure intended to save the kingdom of Spain from poverty that had been taken aboard. 116 trunks of emeralds from Muzo and Somondoko, and 30 million gold coins. The terra firma fleet was composed of no less than 12 supply ships of varying sizes, and it set sail from this port traveling in a convoy with a French squadron that was heavily armed but still incapable of protecting the expedition from the accurate cannon shot of the English squadron under Commander Charles Wager, who waited for it in the Sotavento archipelago on the entrance to the bay. So, the San Jose was not the only sunken vessel, although there was no reliable documented record of how many had succumbed and how many had managed to escape the English fire. What was certain was that the flagship had been among the first to sink, along with the entire crew and the commander standing straight on the quarterdeck, and that she alone carried most of the cargo. In the middle of page 91. Florentino Ariza had learned the route of the Galleons from the navigation charts of the period, and he thought he had determined the site of the shipwreck. They left the bay between the two fortresses of Boca Chica, and after 4 hours of sailing, they entered the interior still waters of the archipelago, in whose coral depths they could pick up sleeping lobsters with their hands. The air was so soft and the sea so calm and clear that Florentino Ariza felt as if he were his own reflection in the water. At the far end of the backwater, 2 hours from the largest island, was the site of the shipwreck. Suffocating in his formal clothes under the infernal sun, Florentino Ariza indicated to Euclides that he should try to dive to a depth of 20 meters and bring back anything he might find at the bottom. The water was so clear that he saw him moving below like a tarnished shark among the blue ones that crossed his path without touching him. Then he saw him disappear into a thicket of coral, and just when he thought he could not possibly have any more air in his lungs, he heard his voice at his back. Euclides was standing at the bottom, with his arms raised at the water up to his waist. And so they continued exploring deeper sights, always moving toward the north, sailing over the indifferent manta rays, the timid squid, the rose bushes in the shadows, until Euclides concluded that they were wasting their time. "If you don't tell me what you want me to find, I don't know how I'm going to find it," he said. but he did not tell him. Then Euclides proposed to him that he take off his clothes and dive in with him, even if it was only to see another sky below the world, the coral depths. But Florentino Ariza always said that God had made the sea to look at through the window, and he had never learned to swim. A short while later, the afternoon grew cloudy, and the air turned cold and damp, and it grew dark with so little warning that they had to navigate by the lighthouse to find the port. Before they entered the bay, the enormous white ocean liner from France passed very close to them, all its lights blazing as it trailed a wake of tender stew and boiled cauliflower. They wasted 3 Sundays in this way, and they would have continued to waste them all if Florentino Ariza had not decided to share his secret with Euclides, who then modified the entire search plan, and they sailed along the old channel of the Galleons more than 20 nautical leagues to the east of the spot Florentino Ariza had decided on. Less than 2 months had gone by when one rainy afternoon out at sea, Euclides spent considerable time down on the bottom, and the canoe drifted so much he had to swim almost half an hour to reach it because Florentino Ariza could not row it closer to him. When at last he climbed on board, he took 2 pieces of women's jewelry out of his mouth and displayed them as if they were prize for his perseverance. What he recounted then was so fascinating that Florentino Ariza promised himself that he would learn to swim and dive as far underwater as possible just so he could see it with his own eyes. He said that in the spot, only 18 meters down, there were so many old sailing ships lying among the coral reefs that it was impossible to even calculate the number, and they were spread over so extensive an area that you could not see to the end of them. He said that the most surprising thing was that none of the old wrecks afloat in the bay was in such good condition as the sunken vessels. He said that there were several caravels with their sails still intact, and that the sunken ships were visible even on the bottom, for it seemed as if they had sunk along with their own space and time, so that they were still illumined by the same 11 o'clock sun that was shining on Saturday, June 9th, when they went down. Choking on the driving force of his imagination, he said that the easiest one to distinguish was the galleon San Jose, for its name could be seen on the poop in gold letters, but it was also the ship most damaged by English artillery. He said he had seen an octopus inside, more than 3 centuries old, whose tentacles emerged through the openings in the cannon, and who had grown to such a size in the dining room that one would have to destroy the ship to free him. He said he had seen the body of the commander dressed for battle and floating sideways inside the aquarium of the forecastle, and that if he had not dived down to the hold with all its treasure, it was because he did not have enough air in his lungs. There were the proofs, an emerald earring, and a medal of the Virgin, the chain corroded by salt. Middle of page 93. That was when Florentino Ariza first mentioned the treasure to Fermina Daza, in a letter he sent to Fonseca a short while before her return. The history of the sunken galleons was familiar to her because she had heard it many times from Lorenzo Daza, who had lost both time and money trying to convince a company of German divers to join him in salvaging the sunken treasure. He would have persevered in the enterprise if several members of the Academy of History had not convinced him that the legend of the shipwrecked galleon had been invented by some brigand of Viceroy to hide his theft of the treasures of the crown. In any case, Fermina Daza knew that the galleon lay beyond the reach of any human being at a depth of 200 meters, not the 20 claimed by Florentino Ariza. But she was so accustomed to his poetic excesses that she celebrated the adventure of the galleon as one of his most successful. Still, when she continued to receive other letters with still more fantastic details, written with as much seriousness as his promises of love, she had to confess to Hildebrand Sanchez her fear that her bedazzled sweetheart must have lost his mind. During this time, Euclides had surfaced with so many proofs of his tale that it was no longer a question of playing with earrings and rings scattered amid the coral, but of financing a major enterprise to salvage the 50 ships with their cargo of Babylonian treasure. Then what had to happen sooner or later? Florentino Ariza asked his mother for help in bringing his adventure to a successful conclusion. All she had to do was bite the metal settings and look at the gems made of glass against the light to realize that someone was taking advantage of her son's innocence. Euclides went down on his knees and swore to Florentino Ariza that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was not even Euclides went down on his knees and swore to Florentina Ariza that he had done nothing wrong. But he was not even seen the following Sunday in the Fisherman's Port or anywhere else again. Ooh. Euclides. The only thing Florentino Ariza salvaged from that disaster was the loving shelter of the lighthouse. He had gone there in Euclides' canoe one night when a storm at sea took them by surprise, and from that time on he would go there in the afternoons to talk to the lighthouse keeper about the innumerable marvels on land and water that the keeper had knowledge of. It was the beginning of a friendship that survived the many changes in the world. Florentino Ariza learned to feed the fire first with the loads of wood and then with large earthen jars of oil before energy came to us. He learned to direct the light and augment it with mirrors, and on several occasions when the lighthouse keeper could not do so, he stayed to keep watch over the night at sea from the tower. He learned how to know the ships by their voices, by the size of their lights on the horizon, and to sense that something of them came back to him in the flashing beacon of the lighthouse. During the day, above all on Sundays, there was another kind of pleasure. In the district of the Viceroys, where the wealthy people of the old city lived, the women's beaches were separated from those of the men by a plaster wall. One lay to the right and the other to the left of the lighthouse, and so the lighthouse keeper installed a spyglass through which one could contemplate the women's beach by playing a centavo. Without knowing they were being observed, the young society ladies displayed themselves to the best of their ability in ruffled bathing suits and slippers and hats that hid their bodies almost as much as their street clothes did, and were less attractive besides. Their mothers sitting out in the sun in wicker rocking chairs, wearing the same dresses, the same feathered hats, and holding the same ordinary parasols as they had at high mass, watched over them from the shore for fear the men from the neighboring beaches would seduce their daughters under the water. The reality was that one could not see anything more or anything more exciting through the spyglass than one could see in the street, but there were many clients who came every Sunday to wrangle over the telescope for the pure delight of tasting the insipid forbidden fruits of the walled area that was denied to them. Florentino Ariza was one of them, far more from boredom than for pleasure, but it was not because of the additional attraction that he became a good friend of the lighthouse keeper. The real reason was that after Fermina Daza rejected him when he contracted the fever of many desperate lovers in his effort to replace her, it was in the lighthouse and nowhere else that he lived his happiest hours and found the best consolation for his misfortunes. It was the place he loved most, so much so that for years he tried to convince his mother and later his uncle Leo the 12th to help him buy it. For in those days, the lighthouses in the Caribbean were private property, and their owners charged ships according to their size for the right to enter the port. Florentino Ariza thought that it was the only honorable way to make a profit out of poetry, but neither his mother nor his uncle agreed with him, and by the time he had the resources to do it on his own, the lighthouses had become the property of the state. Middle of page 95. Let's see how much we have left to go. About 8 pages left. Let's do it. Middle of 95. None of these dreams was in vain, however. I would have said were in vain. It's a translation, though. The tale of the Galleon and the novelty of the lighthouse helped to alleviate the absence of Fermina Daza, and then when he at least expected it, he received the news of her return. And in fact, after a prolonged stay in Riohacha, Lorenzo Daza had decided to come home. It was not the most benign season on the ocean due to the December trade winds and the historic schooner. The only one that would risk the crossing might find itself blown by a contrary wind back to the port where it had started. And that is what happened. Fermina Daza spent an agonized night vomiting bile strapped to her bunk in a cabin that resembled a tavern latrine, not only because of its oppressive narrowness, but also because of the pestilential stench and the heat. The motion was so strong, and she had the impression several times that the straps on the bed would fly apart on the deck. She heard fragments of shouted lamentations that sounded like a shipwreck, and her father's tigerish snoring in the next bunk added yet another ingredient to her terror. For the first time in almost 3 years, she spent an entire night awake without thinking for even one moment of Florentino Ariza, while he, on the other end, lay sleepless in his hammock in the back room, counting the eternal minutes one by one until her return. At the dawn, the wind suddenly died down and the sea grew calm, and Fermina Daza realized that she had slept despite her devastating seasickness because the noise of the anchor chains awakened her. Then she loosened the straps and went to the porthole, hoping to see Florentino Ariza in the tumult of the port, but all she saw were the customs sheds among the palm trees gilded by the first rays of the sun, and the rotting boards of the dock in Rio Hacha, where the schooner had set sail the night before. The rest of the day was like a hallucination. She was in the same house where she had been until yesterday, receiving the same visitors who had said goodbye to her, talking about the same things, bewildered by the impression that she was reliving a piece of life that she had already lived. It was such a faithful repetition that Fermina Daza trembled at the thought that the schooner trip would be a repetition too, for the mere memory of it terrified her. However, the only other possible means of returning home was 2 weeks on muleback over the mountains in circumstances even more dangerous than the first time, since a new civil war that had begun in the Andean state of Cauca was spreading throughout the Caribbean provinces. And so, at 8 o'clock that night, she was once again accompanied to the port by the same troop of noisy relatives, shedding the same tears of farewell, and with the same jumble of last-minute gifts and packages that did not fit in the cabins. When it was time to sail, the men in the family saluted the schooner with a volley of shots fired into the air, and Lorenzo Daza responded from the deck with 5 shots from his revolver. Fermina Daza's fears dissipated because the wind was favorable at night, and there was a scent of flowers at sea that helped her to sleep soundly without the safety straps. She dreamed that she was seeing Florentino Ariza again, and that she took off the mask that she had always seen on him. She dreamed that she was seeing Florentino Ariza again, and that he took off the face that she had always seen on him because, in fact, it was a mask, but his real face was identical to the false one. She got up very early, intrigued by the enigma of the dream, and she found her father drinking mountain coffee with brandy in the captain's bar, his eye twisted by alcohol, but he did not show the slightest hint of uncertainty regarding their return. They were coming into the port. The schooner slipped in silence through the labyrinth of sailing ships anchored in the cove of the public market, whose stench could be smelled several leagues out to sea, and the dawn was saturated by a steady drizzle that soon broke into a full-fledged downpour. Standing watch on the balcony of the telegraph office, Florentino Ariza recognized the schooner, its sails disheartened by the rain, as it crossed La Animas Bay and anchored at the market pier. The morning before, he had waited until 11 o'clock when he learned through a casual telegram of the contrary winds that had delayed the schooner, and on this day he had returned to his vigil at 4 o'clock in the morning. He continued to wait, not taking his eyes off the launch that carried ashore the few passengers who had decided to disembark despite the storm. Halfway across, the launch ran aground, and most of them had to abandon ship and splash through the mud to the pier. At 8 o'clock, after they had waited in vain for the rain to stop, a black stevedore in water up to his waist received Fermina Daza at the rail of the schooner and carried her ashore in his arms, but she was so drenched that Florentino Ariza did not recognize her. Middle of page 97. She herself was not aware of how much she had matured during the trip until she walked into her closed house and at once undertook the heroic task of making it livable again, with the help of Gela Placidia, the black servant who came back from her old slave quarters as soon as she was told of their return. Fermina Daza was no longer the only child, both spoiled and tyrannized by her father, but the lady and mistress of an empire of dust and cobwebs that could be saved only by the strength of invincible love. She was not intimidated because she felt herself inspired by an exalted courage that would have enabled her to move the world. The very night of their return, While they were having hot chocolate and crullers at a large kitchen table, her father delegated her the authority to run the house, and he did so with as much formality as if it were a sacred right. "I turn over to you the keys to your life," he said. She, with all of her 17 years behind her, accepted with a firm hand, conscious that every inch of liberty she won was for the sake of love. The next day, after a night of bad dreams, she suffered her first sense of displeasure at being home, when she opened the balcony window and saw again the sad drizzle in the little park, the statue of the decapitated hero, the marble bench where Florentino Ariza used to sit with his book of verses. She no longer thought of him as the impossible sweetheart, but as the certain husband to whom she belonged, heart and soul. She felt the heavy weight of the time they had lost while she was away. She felt how hard it was to be alive and how much love she was going to need to love her man as God demanded. She was surprised that he was not in the little park as he had been so many times despite the rain, and that she had received no sign of any kind from him, not even a premonition that she was shaken by the sudden idea that he had died. But she put aside the evil thought at once, for in the recent frenzy of telegrams regarding her imminent return, they had forgotten to agree on a way to continue communicating once she was home. The truth is that Florentino Ariza was sure she had not returned until the telegraph operator in Riohacha confirmed that they had embarked on Friday aboard the very same schooner that did not arrive the day before because of the contrary winds, so that during the weekend he watched for any sign of life in her house, and at dusk on Monday he saw through the windows a light that moved through the house and was extinguished a little after 9 in the bedroom with the balcony. He did not sleep, victim to the same fearful nausea that had disturbed his first nights of love. Transito Ariza arose with the first roosters, alarmed that her son had gone out to the patio at midnight and had not yet come back inside, and she did not find him in the house. He had gone to wander along the jetties, reciting love poetry into the wind and crying with joy until daybreak. At 8 o'clock, he was sitting under the arches of the parish cafe, delirious with fatigue, trying to think of how to send his welcome to Fermina Dasa, when he felt himself shaken by a seismic tremor that tore his heart. It was she, crossing the plaza of the cathedral, accompanied by Gala Placidia, who was carrying the baskets for their marketing, and for the first time she was not wearing her school uniform. She was taller than when she had left, more polished and intense, her beauty purified by the restraint of maturity. Her braid had grown in, but instead of letting it hang down her back, she wore it twisted over her left shoulder, and that simple change had erased all girlish traces from her. Florentino Ariza sat bedazzled until the child of his vision had crossed the plaza, looking to neither the left nor the right. But then the same irresistible power that had paralyzed him obliged him to hurry after her when she had turned the corner of the cathedral and was lost in the deafening noise of the market's rough cobblestones. Top of page 99. He followed her without letting himself be seen, watching the ordinary gestures, the grace, the maturity of the being he loved most in the world, and whom he was seeing for the first time in her natural state. He was amazed by the fluidity with which she made her way through the crowd, while Gala Placidia bumped into people and became entangled in her baskets, and had to run to keep up with her. She navigated the disorder of the street in her own time and space, not colliding with anyone, like a bat in the darkness. She had often been to the market with her aunt Scholastica, but they had made only minor purchases, since her father himself took charge of provisioning the household, not only with furniture and food, but even with women's clothing. So this first excursion was, for her, a fascinating adventure, idealized in her girlhood dreams. She paid no attention to the urgings of the snake charmers who offered her a syrup for eternal love, or to the pleas of the beggars lying in the doors with their running sores, or to the false Indian who tried to sell her a trained alligator. She made a long and detailed tour, with no planned itinerary, stopping with no other motive than her unhurried delight in the spirit of things. She entered every doorway where there was something for sale, and everywhere she found something that increased her desire to live. She relished the aroma of vetiver in the cloth in the great chests. She wrapped herself in embossed silks. She laughed her own laughter when she saw herself in the full-length mirror in the golden wire disguised as a woman from Madrid, with a comb in her hair and a fan painted with flowers. In the store that sold imported foods, she lifted the lid of a barrel of pickled herring that reminded her of nights in the northeast when she was a very little girl in San Juan de la Ciénaga. She sampled an Alicante sausage that tasted of licorice, and she bought two for Saturday's breakfast, as well as some slices of cod and a jar of red currants in aguardiente. In the spice shop, she crushed leaves of sage and oregano in the palms of her hand for the pure pleasure of smelling them, and bought a handful of cloves, another of star anise, and one each of ginger root and juniper. And she walked away with tears of laughter in her eyes because the smell of the cayenne pepper made her sneeze so much. In the French cosmetics shop, as she was buying Ritter soaps and balsam water, they put a touch of the latest perfume from Paris behind her ear and gave her a breath tablet to use after smoking. She played at buying, it is true, but what she really needed she bought without hesitation, with an authority that allowed no one to think that she was doing so for the first time, for she was conscious that she was buying not only for herself, but for him as well. 12 yards of linen for their table, percale for the marriage sheets that by dawn would be damp with moisture from both their bodies, the most exquisite of everything for both of them to enjoy in the house of love. She asked for discounts, and she got them. She argued with grace and dignity until she obtained the best, and she paid with pieces of gold that the shopkeepers tested for the sheer pleasure of hearing them sing against the marble counters. Florentino Ariza spied on her in astonishment. He pursued her breathlessly. He tripped several times over the baskets of the maid, who responded to his excuses with a smile, and she passed so close to him that he could smell her scent, as if she did not see him then. It was not because she could not, but because of the haughty manner in which she walked. To him she seemed so beautiful, so seductive, so different from ordinary people, that he could not understand why no one was as disturbed as he by the clicking of her heels on the paving stones, when no one else's heart was wild with the breeze, stirred by the sighs of her veils, why everyone did not go mad with the movements of her braid, the flights of her hands, the gold of her laughter. He had not missed a single one of her gestures, not one of the indications of her character, but he did not dare approach her for fear of destroying the spell. Nevertheless, when she entered the riotous noise of the arcade of the scribes, he realized that he might lose the moment he had craved for so many years. Fermina Daza shared with her schoolmates the singular idea that the arcade of the scribes was a place of perdition that was forbidden, of course, to decent young ladies. It was an arcaded gallery across from a little plaza where carriages and freight carts drawn by donkeys were for hire, where popular commerce became noisier and more dense. The name dated from colonial times, when the taciturn scribes in their vests and false cuffs first began to sit there, waiting for a poor man's fee to write all kinds of documents, memoranda of complaints or petition, legal testimony, cards of congratulation or condolence, love letters appropriate to any stage in an affair. They, of course, were not the ones who had given that thundering market its bad reputation, but more recent peddlers who made illegal sales of all kinds of questionable merchandise smuggled in on European ships, from obscene postcards and aphrodisiac ointments to the famous Catalonian condoms with iguana crests that fluttered when circumstances required, or with flowers at the tip that would open their petals at the will of the user. Fermina Daza, somewhat unskilled in the customs of the street, went through the arcade without noticing where she was going as she searched for a shady refuge from the fierce 11 o'clock sun. She sank into the hot clamor of the shoe-shine boys and the bird sellers, the hawkers of cheap books and the witch doctors and the sellers of sweets who shouted over the din of the crowd, "Pineapple sweets for your sweetie! Coconut candy is dandy! Brown sugar loaf for your sugar!" But indifferent to the uproar, she was captivated on the spot by a paper seller who was demonstrating magic inks, red inks, with an ambience of blood, inks of sad aspects for messages of condolence, phosphorescent inks for reading in the dark, invisible inks that revealed themselves in the light. She wanted all of them so she could amuse Florentina Arisa and astound him with her wit. But after several trials, she decided on a bottle of gold ink. Then she went to the candy sellers sitting behind their big round jars, and she bought 6 of each kind, pointing at the glass because she could not make herself heard over all the shouting. 6 angel hair, 6 tinned milk, 6 sesame seed bars, 6 cassava pastries, 6 chocolate bars, 6 blanc mange, 6 tidbits of the queen, 6 of this and 6 of that, 6 of everything, and she tossed them into the maize baskets with an irresistible grace and a complete detachment from the storm clouds of flies on the syrup, from the continual hullabaloo and the vapor of rancid sweat that reverberated in the deadly heat. She was awakened from the spell by a good-natured black woman with a colored cloth around her head, who was round and handsome, and offered her a triangle of pineapple speared on the tip of a butcher's knife. She took it and she put it whole into her mouth. She tasted it, and was chewing it as her eyes wandered over the crowd, when a sudden shock rooted her to the spot, behind her, so close to her ear, that only she could hear it in this tumult. She heard this voice. She heard his voice, "This is not the place for a crowned goddess." She turned her head and saw, a hand's breadth from her eyes, those other glacial eyes, that livid face, those lips petrified with fear, just as she had seen him in the crowd at midnight mass the first time. He was so close to her, but now, instead of the commotion of love, she felt the abyss of disenchantment. In an instant, the magnitude of her own mistake was revealed to her, and she asked herself, appalled, how she could have nurtured such a chimera in her heart for so long and with so much ferocity. She just managed to think, my God, poor man. Florentina Arisa smiled, tried to say something, tried to follow her, but she erased him from her life with a wave of her hand. No, please, she said, forget it. That afternoon, while her father was taking his siesta, she sent Gala Placida with a two-line letter. Today when I saw you, I realized that what is between us is nothing more than an illusion. We're in the middle of page 102. The maid also returned his telegrams, his verses, his dry camellias, and asked to send back her letters and gifts. Aunt Scholastica's missal, the veins of leaves from her herbariums, the square centimeter of the habit of St. Peter Clavier, the saint's medals, the braid of her 15th year tied with the silk ribbon of her school uniform. In the days that followed, on the verge of madness, he wrote her countless desperate letters and besieged the maid to take them to her, but she obeyed her unequivocal instructions not to accept anything but the returned gifts. She insisted with so much zeal that Florentina Arisa sent them all back except the braid, which he would return only to Fermina Tassa in person, so they could talk, if just for a moment. But she refused. Fearing a decision fatal to her son, Transito Arisa swallowed her pride and asked Fermina Tassa to grant her the favor of 5 minutes of her time, and Fermina Tassa received her for a moment in the doorway of her house, not asking her to sit down, not asking her to come in, and without the slightest trace of weakening. 2 days later, after an argument with his mother, Florentina Arisa took down from the wall of his room the stained glass case where he displayed the braid as if it were a holy relic, and Transita Arisa herself returned it in the velvet box, embroidered with gold thread. Florentina Arisa never had another opportunity to see or talk to Fermina Tassa, alone in the many chance encounters of their very long lives, until 51 years and 9 months and 4 days later, when he repeated his vow of eternal fidelity and everlasting love on her first night as a widow. That is the end of chapter 2, and it's page 103.